Hello again everyone, welcome back to my workshop for another of Harry's little Jeti training videos. And in this episode we're going to be looking at mixing rudder to multi-engine throttles to give throttle steering, with emphasis in particular on preventing the throttle trying to go above 100% at full power and the throttle trying to go below whatever your idle value is. The question was asked on a Facebook group from somebody who's got a multi-engine jet model, genuine gas turbine jets, not EDFs. And so we'll look at it specifically with reference to that for setting up the idle and off trim positions. But with a little bit of adaptation, this will work with EDF, electric prop, and internal combustion prop. You just have to be careful, particularly with things like the throttle lock, because on multiple throttles it will not work. It only works on one specific channel. See some of my other videos if you need it to work on multiple channels. So I'll very quickly run through how I would set up the throttles, because the chap on the Facebook group said that he'd mixed one throttle to the other, which I would not recommend doing, and I'll show you how I would set it up. You know, if you want to do it a different way, that's fine. And particularly how I get the one-step trim, because it'll be important to show that in the video that it's working with that. But the interesting bit is how we get rudder to multi-engine throttle mixing without overdriving the endpoints. Because of course, if you have particularly a turbine and you go above 100%, it's not going to go above 100%. But if your mix at idle tries to take you below the idle point, there is certainly a great risk of the ECU thinking that that's the shutdown command and trying to shut down that engine. You need at least 2 throttles in order to do rudder to throttle, multi-throttle mixing. The reason being, Jeti mixing is function to function. So if you simply do rudder to throttle and you have multiple servos, ECUs, speed controllers, whatever, on channels attached to that throttle, they're all going to get the same. So they're all going to go up or they're all going to go down, but you're not going to get up on one side and down on the other. So we need multiple throttles. Right, so I'll try and skip through setting up the turbine bit of it as fast as possible, just so we can get to the interesting bit, which is how do we stop the mixes going above 100% or below your idle power. And that will apply to, say, any type of engine. So anyway, model, functions assignment, I'm going to create another throttle. Just for speed of going in here, I'm going to call it T2. And we'll assume that throttle is the left-hand engine or group of engines, and that T2 is the right-hand engine or group of engines. If you assign multiple servos to it, say OK. So, and move our throttle stick, which in my case is P4. There we go. And if we say OK to that, in servo assignment, we can, there we are, we've got throttle in T2. Now, you don't need to do this, but just for ease of seeing the two of them together on screen, I'm going to make that one T2, so we can easily watch in the servo monitor what's going on. Okay, and that's that for the moment. If we have a look in servo monitor with the default stick travel, throttle back, throttle fully open. But of course there is an issue with trim, in that trim will only be working on throttle at the moment and not on T2. Okay, how do we get that to work? Because it's important for the turbine particularly that, let's say, minus 100% is regarded as turbine off, and then some lesser percentage, say minus 75, is regarded by the ECU as turbine now into the run state, or idle if it's actually running. So how do we get the trim to both of them? We go to fine tuning, digital trim, come down here into that, press the plus button, digital trim, choose our trimmer, say OK, come across here and assign it to T2. Has that done the job? Not quite, because if we move along here we see that it's a centered, not throttle low. So we need to change that to a throttle low trim. Okay, and this now at least means that the both outputs will be working the same. So let's have a look in servo monitor. Here's our two throttles, fully open, fully closed, and now we'll see that the trim is working beautifully on both. Until recently, that would not work. There was a bug in Jeti software, but they fixed it at last in one of the recent upgrades, so we can now get the trim working properly on the other throttle. And that may be as far as you want to go. Some people with their turbines like to, trim down and trim up beep, beep, beep at a time. I don't. I like one step. Also, I don't want it going below -100. I don't want it coming down here. So I want it to go from there as the off position to something like -75, -70, whatever, as the run position. And I like to make the smallest step that the ECU will recognize. But that varies between different brands of ECUs, and it sometimes takes a little bit of experimentation when you're doing the teach at the radio to see just how much of a step it needs to recognize the difference between off and on. So say OK to that, come back to fine tuning, digital trim, we go into our throttle. I'm going to make the step 100%. Okay, so at the moment, if I left it at that, instead of beep, 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 beep all the way, then you'd get just one trim down beep, and it would jump the whole way, and one trim up beep, and it would jump the whole way. This is your trim down, this is your trim up. I said I don't want trim down, I don't want it going below the -100%, so I'm going to switch that to 0. And that means when I bring the trim back, that function isn't going to go below -100%. It's effectively disabled, going into -101, -102. And the rate here, these are trims. The value of a trim in servo travel is half the trim value. So what 100% on the up trim button is going to give you a 50% servo travel. So the output value would go from -100% to -50%. I said I only want it to go to about -75%. That's a 25% servo travel. And since that's half of a trim value, I want the trim value to be just 50%. There we go. And I'll do the same to our other throttle. Set that so it's one click of trim. I don't want it going back at all. Oops, daisy. And set that to 50. Say OK. Let's have a look at the effect on these. So here's our throttles, -100, +100. Come back here. I'll press the down trim button. Nothing will happen. It can't move because we set the rate to 0%. I'll press the up trim button. In one step, it will jump 25 percentage points of travel because we set the trim to 50. And trim, remember, is only 0.5% of travel. So I'll press the up trim button. There we are. Got full throttle travel there. And if I press the up trim button again, nothing will happen. It's at the end of its travel. I press down trim. So that's how I get one step trim. Right, on to the interesting meat of this. Let's go to free mixes, and we're going to need 4 mixers, 2 for each throttle. So we want a rudder to throttle and rudder to throttle, and we want a rudder to T2 and a rudder to T2. And the reason being is that we're going to have a mixer for left rudder to the left throttle and a mixer for right rudder to the left throttle, and then also a left rudder to right throttle and a right rudder to right throttle, so that we can control what's happening when we're at full throttle or idle. So let's pop straight into that for the moment. Say from rudder to throttle, come down here, and let's say we're after a mix value, wrong button, mix value of 20%. Now, Now, what we're going to do is make the switch controlled by the throttle itself. That way we can have a full mix on at, say, full throttle or idle, but off at the opposite end. And that's what allows us to at least control whether the mix comes in or not. So let's go in here, move the throttle stick. We need it to be proportional, but what we don't want is the mix going from one side to the other. What we need it is to go from, let's say, no mix at idle to full mix at full throttle. So to do that, we give it a center, and that way, instead of going minus 100 to plus 100, it only goes from 0 to plus 100. So there's the throttle at idle. The mix will have no effect, and it will proportionally grow until we get to full throttle. Say OK to that. And now we need to manipulate the curve. Let's pop in here. Now let's have a think about this. This is the rudder to left throttle. It's going to be, we've set it so that the mix is fully on at full throttle. Now at full throttle, if we push left rudder, we want the throttle to reduce. But if we push right rudder, we don't want to have any effect, because you can't get above 100% throttle, which is what you would be trying to do, say with the left-hand engine. So you can't do that, it can only reduce in power. How do we do that? So that it works when we move the stick left, but has no effect if we move the stick to the right. Well, we do this. You can draw a 3-point if you like, manually, but conveniently Jeti has built these curves in for us. Look at that. That one will have an effect if we push the rudder stick out to the right, but no effect if we push rudder stick left. But that's not what we want. Remember, this is the full throttle mix for left rudder to the left, or for rudder to the left engine. And we want it to have, therefore, a reduction in throttle when we push left rudder, but no effect if we push right rudder. So we move on to that one, and there we are. This mix will take effect when we move the stick left, but no effect when we move the stick to the right. Now, if you're wondering why the target marker is only moving part way down and not coming down here, it's moving left and right as I move the rudder stick left and right, but it's showing then vertically the actual output value of the mixer. And remember, we set the output value to a maximum of 20%, so that's where it's moving. And this is at full throttle. Now I'm going to move the throttle progressively back to idle, which is where we don't want it to have any effect, because we can't pull the left engine down below idle. So watch the target marker move back up to the middle, the 0%, as I move the throttle stick now to idle. I'm holding in full left rudder. See, it's moving back up to 0. You'd think it would move smoothly, but it doesn't quite. It tends to jump. But don't worry, the output is actually moving smoothly. So that's what we're going to get. The throttle stick at idle, I'll move the rudder left and right, which is shown by the target marker moving left and right, but it's not moving up or down, so there is no mix to the throttle. I'll move to full throttle now. I'll move the target rudder right, target marker doesn't go up or down, so there's no mix, but as I move the rudder stick left, it's going to have an effect on the throttle. Say OK to that. Let's have a little look here. By the way, this number shows the actual output value of the mixer. The mixer's fully on because the throttle's fully open, so the master value of 20 is being applied at 100%. As I pull the throttle back, it will reduce that value. Watch it reduce. As I get to the throttle all the way back, although we've got a value of 20%, because the switch is now at 0, the output is 0 and it moves smoothly. Let's have a look at servo monitor. So this was purely the left rudder to left throttle mixer. I'm going to apply right rudder Now, in fact, let's bring the engines up to the run condition. So I'll apply right rudder. It won't have any effect. See, the rudder's moving right, but it's not affecting our left throttle. I'll move left rudder. It should have no effect on it because our throttle stick is at idle. There we go. Now I'll go to full throttle. I'll apply right rudder. It should have no effect on the output there because remember, the mixer is that flat curve to the right. But now, when I move left rudder, it pulls that down. There we go. So our left throttle is reduced at full throttle. It's not pushed upwards at full throttle. And if we come back to idle, it's having no effect. If we take the throttle to about the middle, there we go, we'll see that we have a partial effect. Okay, push right, nothing, left, and it does reduce it. Okay, and basically we just work our way through that for the other three directions and throttles. So we say okay, say okay to that. So we create another rudder. Now we can whiz through it quite quickly. We know what we're doing. Rudder to throttle, advanced, master value 20%, switch. Now this time, this is going to be for the right rudder to the left throttle. And we want that to work at idle. Because if we push in right rudder, we want the left engine to come up in power. But at full throttle, we don't want it to come up in power. So let's have a look at what we do with the switch this time. Once again, we move P4, set it proportional, give it a center, but we need to reverse it. The reason being that's idle, that's full power. And remember this time, we want right rudder to bring the left-hand engine up in power when we're at idle, but not to affect it when we are at full power. So we just reverse it. So now at full throttle, no mix, idle power, full mix. Say okay to that. What curve will we choose? Well, let's have a think about this one first. Will this work? I'm going to push in right rudder. Yes, it has an effect. Left rudder, not doing anything. And right rudder, as we can see, is giving you a bit of mix because the throttle's at idle. If I move the throttle to full throttle, the mix output goes to 0. So the mix output's a flat line at full throttle, and it has a mix value when we move right rudder only at idle. So okay to that. Let's have a look at the effect of it on servo monitor. Throttle is at idle. If I push in left rudder, the left throttle should not reduce. Now if I push in right rudder, it should come up in value. It does. Let's go to full throttle. If I push in left rudder, the left throttle should reduce in value, but it should not increase in value when I push in right rudder. There we go. Okay. And now we can very quickly whiz through the other two. So from that to T2 this time. And let's give it a master value, the opposite direction this time, minus 20%. And the switch, move the throttle, say proportional, give it a center. So this is the full throttle version, idle. And so which curve will we want? This is the full throttle on the right engine. So we will want it to reduce throttle if we give right rudder, but do nothing if we give left rudder. Which looks like that curve to me. Throttle to the right does something, throttle to the left does nothing. And if we give it full power, right throttle, it's going to have a reducing effect. Sorry, right rudder has a reducing effect at full throttle. No effect left because we don't want it increasing. Say okay to that. Let's have a look at the effect on servo monitor. Okay, here is our right throttle, I'll give it left rudder, nothing should happen. I'll give it right rudder and it should reduce. There we go. Okay. And finally, from rudder to T2, advanced master value, overshot again, minus 20%, switch, throttle, proportional, give it a center, but reverse it this time because now we want all the mix version to be at the bottom end. Say OK, come to our curve, stop at that one for a moment. This time the mix is going to take effect at idle on the right hand engine. So we don't want it to work on right rudder because we don't want it reducing the right hand engine, but we do want it to work on left rudder because we want it to increase. So that's no good. This has an effect on right rudder but no effect on left rudder. So move on to the next curve. Nil effect on right rudder, takes all its effect on left rudder. Lovely. And it's at idle. If I push to full power, doesn't do anything. Flatlining, good. Let's have a look then at the effect on servo monitor. Right, we're up at full power. I'm going to push left rudder, so the left throttle should reduce, but the right throttle do nothing. Here we are. Still at full power, I'll push in right rudder. The right throttle should reduce, but the left throttle do nothing. There we are. Come to idle. I'll go left rudder. Left throttle should now do nothing, but the right throttle should come up. And right rudder, right throttle should do nothing, but left throttle come up. There we are. And if we go to about the middle, we get roughly half and half. It's affected a little by the fact that we've got the idle trim in. If I move it up to about there, so we get a mixing of the two effects. So the difference in throttle between each side remains roughly constant, whether you're at full power or at idle. And that way you can get a fairly constant yawing effect, assuming, of course, your thrust curves are all beautifully balanced and that kind of thing. Okay, and that is how I would go about it. You might find a different way of doing it, in which case, well done, have fun with it.